Welcome to the Self-Made Math. This is episode 1 on the Coalition Radio Network. My name is Rich Southwell, and before we get started, I wanted to give Pat Ford and the Coalition Radio Network a big thank you for the opportunity and the platform to talk about a problem that I think is very, very important for our children, and share with you a little bit a project that I have gotten underway to help address that problem. So with that, I think we'll jump in. The problem that we're talking about is innumeracy, and the second problem might be technology. We'll see how I do here. All right, so there we go. And as I said, the problem that we have and that we want to talk about tonight is the problem of innumeracy in America. And if we're going to talk about a problem and give it a name, we should probably explain what the name is. So what is innumeracy? I could splash a definition up on the screen, but I think it's more powerful and productive to show you what I mean by innumeracy. So we're going to do a quick exercise. This is a book, and this is a paragraph about the book. Now, if I asked you to take a few minutes, read this paragraph and tell me what the main idea of the paragraph is, and maybe pull out a couple of key details, most people on this program would have a reasonable time accomplishing that task. We all have our different strengths and abilities, and not everybody's the best reader, and everybody reads well for comprehension. But fundamentally, most people could do a reasonable job completing that task. Now, if I were to show you this and ask you to do the same thing, that is, what is the main idea? What are a couple of key details about this? You might start to get a little bit nervous because not everybody is as comfortable with numbers. You might start to have a deep sense of foreboding because of all those numbers on the page, and they're very tiny. And then if I told you that this was just page 1 of 27 and said, I still need for you to give me the main idea of this 27-page pile of numbers and some of the key details, you might start to get really, really uncomfortable at that point because not everybody loves numbers. Now, that discomfort with numbers is only an issue in this situation if you happen to live in the town of Gloucester, Rhode Island, and pay taxes there, because this is part of the proposed budget for 2021 and 2022 fiscal year. So if you're not comfortable dealing with numbers and interpreting these numbers, you're at a disadvantage and you don't get to fully participate in the conversation about the budget. So that degree of, hey, I can read words and understand ideas just fine, but if you put it into numerical format, I kind of get really uncomfortable and I don't do nearly as well and I'm not nearly as effective. That's what innumeracy is. It's the inability to work effectively with numbers. And that's a problem for our kids, for multiple generations, and actually it's a national problem. So innumeracy, as you may have guessed from the tax example there on the budget, is a bad thing. So thank you, Captain Obvious, for providing us with that keen insight. But why is innumeracy a bad thing? On an individual level, innumeracy is a bad thing because the inability to work with numbers and interpret numbers means that our children, who we're trying to get properly skilled to go out into the world, are going to miss out on a lot of opportunities because they lack the essential skills that they need to be successful. So some of those opportunities they will know that they missed out on, and others they won't even know were opportunities at all because they didn't know that they existed because they weren't familiar with math. And on a personal level, I've seen this throughout my career. I've been enumerate for most of my life up until about 10 years ago when I made a career change that required me to learn a lot of sophisticated math from scratch. Hence the name of the show, The Self-Made Math. I did it by myself, grabbed some books, got a lot of help along the way. But fundamentally, it was self-driven. So this is the Self-Made Math. And I'm trying to share some of the things that I learned with my son and other kids in the middle school setting, so that they don't miss out on all the opportunities that I missed out on. Another problem of innumeracy for individuals is money. The less comfortable you are dealing with numbers, the less effective you're going to be dealing with money. And that can be everything from the household budget to planning for retirement, to the way that you use credit and whether you use it effectively or if at all, or whether you abuse it or misuse it and find yourself in a very, very deep hole at 24.5% interest. So those are individual problems associated with being enumerate. The lost opportunities, the missed opportunities, and the money problems that frequently follow in their wake. As I said, innumeracy is not an individual problem. It is now a national problem. So when we look at innumeracy at a national level, you have an entire population of people that really have a difficult time interpreting and conceptualizing numbers. So when we think about big numbers, there's no better place to go than the federal government. But let's start very, very small here for a minute. We can all probably think about $1,000. If we took $1,000 and multiplied that by 1,000, we would end up with $1 million. Okay, everybody figures that's straightforward enough, but let's put a little context around that. If you were to stash $1,000 under your mattress every day, it would take you 1,000 days to reach $1 million. Every morning, getting that $1,000, sticking it under the mattress. No weekends off, no holidays. 1,000 days. That's 2 3/4 years just to get to that $1 million. So that's what $1,000 times 1,000 really looks like. Now we'll upsize it a little bit because we are talking about the federal government, and we know that they travel in very, very large numbers. So if we take that $1 million that we just talked about and multiply that by 1,000, that gets us to $1 billion. These are numbers that we hear coming out of Washington. And if we take that $1 billion and multiply that by 1,000, we now hear that number trillion more and more in the news as spending bills go out. And it's difficult, again, just like it was with that $1,000 getting to $1 million, it's difficult to conceptualize a number called a trillion. So we just kind of look right past it. But put that in a little bit of context. We have 330 million people living in the United States. For every $1 trillion that gets spent, that's $3,030 per person. So to put that and make it very personal for each person listening or watching, take a quick head count of how many people are living under your roof. And then the next time you hear about a $1 trillion spending bill, take the number of people living under your roof, multiply it by about $3,000. And that's your household cut of that $1 trillion spending bill. That adds up very, very fast. And I know with 3 people living in my house, $9,000 is a pretty big number. So those are the problems of innumeracy. How did we get here? It didn't happen overnight. And in fact, it's been something that's on the national radar, particularly in education, for about 38 years. President Reagan, there he is on the right, the Gipper, he commissioned a study by the Department of Education, which was published in 1983. It was called A Nation at Risk. And the general idea that I would love to come back at some point and do a deep dive into this piece, but the general idea was we put a man on the moon multiple times, one of the greatest technological feats in the history of humankind. And then by about 1971, we started to fall asleep, and the rest of the world kept advancing in terms of math, science, technology, and America was again asleep. So we were losing our edge. Hence the title, A Nation at Risk. And this particular publication was credited with the beginnings of education reform and really trying to get at and get our groove back in math, something that had kind of fallen away during the 70s and was becoming very apparent by the early 1980s. So a pivotal paper. Many of the problems were diagnosed head on. They had a very clear view of the future that was largely accurate, but yet we're sitting here 38 years later, and quite frankly, we're not really any better off than we were when A Nation at Risk. And in fact, we may be worse off than we were when A Nation at Risk was first published. There are a number of factors that contribute to this innumeracy issue that we have in the school system. Some of them happen at school, some of them happen at home. At the school setting, math simply doesn't get the amount of time and focus that it requires for kids to master the concepts. And so for an example, Subject matter is very complex and the time frames are very aggressive. So we have complex subject matter and we have very little time to get the entire class through the situation, through the lesson. And so as an example, this is a lesson plan from Engage New York. It's a Common Core curriculum that's widely used across the country, including here in Rhode Island. This is a typical lesson out of the grade 7 Common Core lesson plan. So lesson 8 is called Representing Proportional Relationships with Equations. It's a whole lot of big fancy math words in there. And our student outcome that day is going to be that students will use the constant of proportionality to represent proportional relationships by equations in real-world contexts as they relate the equations to a corresponding ratio table or graphical representation. Clear as mud, right? Pretty weighty, pretty heavy objective for the day. Guess how long they have to do it? According to the suggested lesson plan in the manual, the teacher has a mere 40 minutes to get the entire class through that lesson and accomplish that objective. The manual is also kind enough to break it out for us. We have 5 minutes for discussion. We have 33 minutes, not 31, not 34. Don't you dare go over 33 minutes to complete examples 1 and 2. And then we'll wrap it up with a closing that lasts for 2 minutes. Now, what does the closing look like? The teacher has 2 minutes to summarize everything with this lesson summary. This appears in the student's textbook as well as in the teacher's manual. There's your lesson summary. If a proportional relationship is described, I'm not going to read this whole thing. I am going to highlight a couple of things though. Number one, if we look at the yellow, that is a very, very long if-then statement. You've got an if condition with multiple conditions that need to be satisfied. And then your then is a little bit shorter, more reasonable, but there's a lot of work packed into that 2 lines worth of code or 2 lines worth of text. And then we have this constant of proportionality, which is a giant, big, fancy math word. And we use that to express the multiplicative relationship between X value and the corresponding Y value. Now, all of this is meant to provide an example of just how thick the math curriculum is and how little time the teacher and the students have to work together to accomplish all of this. After looking at some of these lesson plans and going through some of the Common Core curriculum, I'm a lot more sympathetic to math teachers, and I have a much better idea of what my son was going through when he was in elementary school, working through these things. There's also issues that go on at home that contribute to the innumeracy problem. Again, math simply doesn't get the amount of time and focus that it requires for kids to master concepts. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because I said it just a couple minutes ago when we were talking about the contributing factors at school. It's the same problem, but it has different causes and different impacts. Cause number one is that as parents, we tend to stop reinforcing math lessons when the flashcards run out. So when we're in kindergarten, 1, 2, 3, we're memorizing math facts. Great, we've got flashcards, they're pre-printed. We know the answers. If we don't know the answers are clearly written on the back of the flashcard. Very easy for us to get through. But come about 3rd grade, the kids start to see much more complicated concepts coming along. They start seeing word problems with multiple steps. Things get very, very complicated very, very quickly. And there's no easy tool for a parent to use to reinforce that. So when the flashcards go away, we tend to drop out of the picture. Problem number 2 for parents is that we know the math, but we can't explain it to ourselves, let alone a middle schooler. This is the common problem of, I know that $100 item at the store is 10% off, and that means that I'll save $10 and I'll pay $90 for that item. But I can't necessarily tell you why that's the case. I've just been doing it for so long. I know it to be true and I know it's right. So if I can't explain it to myself, then the idea of showing it and trying to explain it to my child who has never seen it before and has no idea what any of this means is very, very difficult. So there's a lot of knowledge inside of us as parents that's been buried so deep for so long that it's difficult to bring up again and remember why we do what we do or how we do it. Here's an uncomfortable cause. We may be enumerate ourselves. Not everyone is comfortable with math. Many of us have deep emotional scars from our time in school studying math. I know I do. I can tell stories about it. I probably will in a future episode. It's a very complicated subject. It's very difficult to master, and many of us don't. And we go through life really struggling with numbers and being uncomfortable. So when our child brings home math homework and we start to see all those numbers swimming around on the page, we get very, very uncomfortable, and we don't necessarily want to get involved with it. Next cause, we are old and the math is new. So we learned math many, many years ago, decades for most of us parents. And there have been a lot of developments and changes in the way those same math concepts are taught. Things like tape diagrams and unbundling and new terms that we've never heard before. So as difficult as it may be for us to explain a concept that we know, layering on the fact that it's being taught in a completely different way today makes it that much more difficult. And then finally, we're busy with other competing priorities. So we've got a limited amount of time with our children at home. We've got after school activities, we've got work, we've got sports for them, we've got really housework and anything else that will give us an excuse not to jump into that math homework. And so math kind of languishes there. So just as it doesn't get enough time and attention at school, nor does it get enough time and attention at home. And over a period of time of many years through K through 12, they're just not getting enough math. And more specifically, they're getting exposed to the concepts, but they're not getting enough practice and enough opportunities to master those concepts. Another discussion item for how we get comfortable with the progress or lack of progress with our children in math is that we don't benchmark well. Singapore, Taiwan, Estonia, those are leading countries in math education. They have some of the best math scores in the world. Those are good benchmarks. That's who you want to be shooting to become. RICAS scores are not great benchmarks. And all I mean by that is if you get your local, your state level testing result and you see your child is in the middle of the pack for the state or the middle of the pack for your district, that may not be good enough. They may be in the middle of a very slow moving pack. If you told me that they were in the middle of the pack by Singapore standards, I'd say, oh, they're pretty smart. And they're probably far, far and away ahead of their classmates here in the United States. So you got to figure out who you want to compare yourself to. And we typically, generally don't compare ourselves to world leaders. We compare ourselves internally amongst ourselves in a situation where we're all struggling. So you're on kind of a mediocre team at best, and you're trying to be the best of the mediocres, but that's not the way to grow, and it's not the way to advance. Is there any good news here? Yeah, there is good news, and it comes from the most unlikely of places. For all the disruption and destruction that it has caused, COVID-19 pandemic has made parents and given us the opportunity to be more involved in our children's education. So we now we got our first look during remote learning back in the spring of 2020. Many of us decided to homeschool. Others have had, multiple quarantines or school closures. The kids are home doing a lot more learning at home. So we're seeing what they're getting, what they're not getting, how they process, and we're learning things that we never had insight into before, other than the typical report card and parent-teacher conference. So this is an opportunity. We've got more time together. We've got more insight than we have. And there's an opportunity here to dig in a little bit and start chipping away at some of these deficits, particularly in the area of math, which is my area of passion because of my own experience with it. That's why I came up with Selfmade Math. A little bit of background, as I said, I've been enumerate for the majority of my life up till about 10 years ago. When I decided to make a career change and become an actuary and get involved with some very, very sophisticated math. And we can talk about that career path in another episode. But what's important to know is I struggled horribly K through 12 throughout college and even in business school. I had to be very careful about what classes that I selected because I knew that my math skills were extremely weak. So when my son came along, I decided that the one thing he would not do is stress and struggle through math. He'd learn it up front. He could do whatever he wanted in life, but I wanted him to have the option that comes with and the opportunities that come with having a good math background. He may never use calculus, but he should know it. And so I started off very early in his life trying to get him acquainted with math and comfortable with numbers, with mixed degrees of success, depending on the year and the subject, the particular topic within math. But I've started to put some of those pieces together and some of the things that I've learned in some of the activities that we've done into a YouTube channel. So not only is a YouTube channel, however, it's so much more, and you can put your phone up to that QR code, and that will take you out to a list of links for Facebook, Patreon, and YouTube, where you can start to follow some of the content that I'm creating now around middle school math. And the idea here is really 3 categories of content that I want to make. Number 1, life examples of the math concepts that our children are learning in school now. So mine is in 7th grade. 6th and 7th grade are all about ratios. They're about proportions. They're about percents. And that's a lot of what you see in places like the grocery store, a restaurant receipt, anytime that money changes hands, there's percent and dollar math in there and proportions that we can work with. So trying to take some of those examples, and I'll give you one in just a minute, but take those real life examples of every day, some of the most mundane tasks ever, but showing where the math is in that so that they get the extra practice. Second category that I am focused on is introducing tools like calculators and spreadsheets into the math process. Now, when I was growing up, if you used a calculator to do your math homework, that was considered cheating. I have a much more refined, nuanced view of that now. And the rule in my house is we periodically test to make sure he hasn't forgotten all of his math facts. But if you can set up a particular problem, a word problem, in a spreadsheet or in a calculator, and that gets you out of doing some of the repetitive calculations that go along with those longer problems, then you know how to do the problem. So by all means, use a spreadsheet, use a calculator. And I think that's very powerful for a lot of kids who really get bogged down in all of the just manual calculations that go in into these problems. And they're so focused on solving for every little step along the way and really addressing the trees that they completely miss the idea of the problem, which is the forest. So we'll definitely have some content on how to use a tool, when to use a tool, and when it's inappropriate to use a tool. And then finally, tips and tricks for learning how to learn math context. So learning math is not like learning other subjects. It has its own vocabulary. It has its own set of symbols. It has its own layout, process, rules, relationships. It's unlike any other topic at school or subject at school that our kids study. And there's ways to get in front of that. And as someone who took actuarial exams for about 7 or 8 years and passed some, passed many, there's a lot of things that you can do to organize that information in a particular way so that it flows and it connects, and it's like assembling a Lego. And by the end of it, you've got a very strong wall of Legos that are tightly interlocked. So I'll definitely be putting out content in that area as well. So I mentioned real life experiences and some of the most mundane things in the world. This is a box of Cheez-It snack crackers, right? Doesn't get too much more mundane than that. It's chock full of cheesy, salty snack goodness, and it's also chock full of a lot more math than you might think. For example, we go to the grocery store and we see the Cheez-Its are on sale, 2 boxes for $7. What's the unit price? If we buy those Cheetos on sale, or those Cheez-Its, excuse me, I said Cheez-Its, on sale, how much did we save? The dollars are easy enough to figure out, but what about the percentage savings? How do we know if that's a good deal or not? Once we get those Cheetos home, can we use the label to estimate how many crackers are in that box? As a matter of fact, we can. We have the number of servings in the box. We have the number of crackers per serving. So if we set up our units, which we do throughout 6th and 7th grade, we work with units all the time. We've got 12 servings in that box. There's 27 crackers per serving. That is a unit rate, which comes up all the time in 6th grade and gets used regularly in 7th. We cancel out our units because that's what we do in 6th and 7th grade. So we end up with an estimate of 324 crackers. The next logical question is, how many were actually in the box? And yes, we did that work. We opened the box, we dumped them in a bowl, we started portioning out servings. And spoiler alert, we were expecting to get 12 servings. We ended up with 11 servings and a bowl full of brokens and crumbs. So not sure exactly what happened there. We actually did do the weighing as well before we dumped. But we ended up with far fewer than we expected. But how close was our estimate in percent terms? Were we off by 10%? Were we off by 20%? You'll have to wait and go view the next video to find out about that. Why am I doing this? This is when I come back to my own personal experience with math. And I'm actually going to come back on camera because I think it's important to and there we are, we're back. So the reason I'm doing this is, as I said, I went through my entire academic career woefully underskilled in math. It started in 1st grade. I had some trouble with subtraction, something like 23 minus 9. We called it borrowing in those days. Now we call it unbundling. It's one of those. It was taught differently. The math is new. But a week of struggling with subtraction and just not getting that technique got me labeled as not good at math. So the teachers told my parents, well, he's really good at reading, writing, his spelling is good, he's very good verbally, he talks well in class, but this math thing, it's just, it's a challenge for him and he's just never going to be good at math. But that's okay because he's excelling in the other areas, and it's unusual to have a child that excels at both things. And that kind of parent-teacher conference in 1st grade from the kid who couldn't quite subtract yet kind of put me on a path. It set a certain expectation with my parents. He's good at some stuff, but he's not good at math. It set us an expectation for me. It tracked me through the school system in a particular way. And so I kind of gradually fell further and further behind until we got to junior year of high school, where I needed to take a math class. And I ended up getting placed in something called computer math applications, which was literally half a year, 1 semester of going into the computer lab and playing a game called Hot Dog Stand, where you managed a hot dog stand in a stadium and you got weather reports and you had different costs for soda, hot dog buns. And, depending on the type of event that was coming in, you were trying to make as much money as you could and become the top dog. So that was my junior year math education in a world where, we were putting space shuttles up in space and we had computers coming into the workforce all over the place. Rich was playing, Hot Dog Stand and you can Google it and find some of the newer versions of it. It's still in use, or it was up to a couple of years ago. Really not an impressive math resume for high school. That carried into college. I ended up taking remedial math in college. I did not get it the first time. In a couple of cases, I had to retake it a couple of times. So I burned a lot of money, barely trying to coast my way through. Took night classes. Those were generally easier to kind of ride the curve on and just, kind of scrape by. And then when I got to time to choose a major, I wanted to study finance, but I looked at the classes. I didn't have the math background for it. So I ended up, my second major was in business law instead of finance. My primary major was risk management and insurance. I did fine there, but I ended up taking business law because I could write papers, but couldn't hack the math for finance. So a long, long road of struggle and failure with math that I trace back to, at least in part. I mean, I certainly, I kind of gave up on it as well. Nobody was expecting me to do well in math, so why would I bother? But you could all kind of go back to that initial diagnosis of he's just not good at math. And I'm here to tell you that as someone who eventually went out and bought a calculus book, learned calculus so that he could pass the probability exam for the Casualty Actuarial Society, anybody can learn math. So, and I'm, living proof of that. And so I feel very strongly that any kid who's struggling in math, even in middle school, if their fundamentals are shoddy, that can all be rebuilt, and they can, eventually move on and succeed and excel in math. It can be done by anybody. It just needs to be learned and focused on. So that's why I've created the Self-Made Math. I'm really looking forward to creating the content. I've got my first video up on the YouTube channel. I'll drop the second one later this week. It involves Cheez-It crackers. We've got a couple more to do with Cheez-It crackers. We've got nutrition labels for various cereals. We've got coupons at CVS, which is one of my favorite places to shop because they've got so many different varieties of coupons, and it's a great order of operations exercise for those who are working with that in 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. So there's a lot to do, a lot of content out there, and I do try and make it approachable, entertaining for the kids and for the parents. Hopefully it's something that you'll enjoy watching together. But that's what I'm doing. And I'd also like to come back here and do longer form discussions on various aspects of math education, maybe do some parent forums and learn from other people and what they're doing with their kids to get them through math. We're living in a very strange time, but our kids are continuing to get older. Every day they get one day older. And so they need to be acquiring the skills that they need so that when they go out into the world, they're well equipped and they can go out and succeed at whatever it is they choose to do. So that's what I'm focused on right now. I hope that the Self-Made Math is, contributes to that for a number of families. And I'm looking very much forward on working on the project throughout 2022. So that wraps up my comments for this evening. I'd like to thank you for joining me. I hope to see you over at the Self-Made Math. I will leave some links in the description below. I also leave them within the YouTube videos, but drop me some comments either here or over on my YouTube channel. Let me know what's working in those videos, what's not working, topics that you'd like to see. I definitely take requests, and I am, again, like I said, looking forward to working on the content, but also working on content that people want to see and find valuable. So thank you again for your time tonight. Enjoyed this first episode and look forward to seeing more of you on the second and subsequent episodes. Have a great night. Thank you.